All right, so I'm going to be talking about natural kinds projectability and different levels of psychiatric classification. These have been topics I've talked about before. Um, so yeah, let's go. So recently, some philosophers, they've resuscitated biological essentialism in the context of arguments about species. These views, they imply that biological taxa, including species, have essences. So for example, we have the HPC theory by Boyd. We have arguments for intrinsic essentialism by Michael Devitt. We have arguments for relational essentialism, Ruth Millikan, Paul Griffiths, Samir Kasha. They've given arguments of this sort. And so Mark Ereshefsky, he's argued against all these various incarnations of the new biological essentialism. And he concludes that, there's many costs of these views, including adopting views that are inconsistent with Darwinian theory, introducing theoretical concepts that aren't required for understanding biological practices. And there's no theoretical benefits, right? So he draws this very strong argument against new biological essentialism. And I think Ereshefsky's analysis, it really fails to sufficiently appreciate the epistemic benefit of intrinsic biological essentialism. So I'm thinking about Boyd's and Devitt's views. And so what I'm going to argue is that scientific classifications that individuate intrinsic biological properties and mechanisms shared by its members, they yield robust and amplitude projectable inferences. So, whatever its merits for understanding species concepts, intrinsic biological essentialism is crucial for explaining how human science classifications produce stable and useful predictions. And so in my talk today, I'm going to defend a kind of minimal essentialism, intrinsic essentialism about natural kinds. I'm going to argue it's needed to explain the projectability of human science terms. So I'm going to try to combine insights of Boyd's HPC theory and Devitt's intrinsic essentialism, but apply it to humankind. I think some of these issues, they get clouded in the context about species because they're really focused on this this trait problem of trying to explain traits, but I think this doesn't really exhaust the kind of benefits you can get out of being a minimal intrinsic essentialist. So my main argument is going to be that human science classifications that individuate HPC kinds constituted by intrinsic biological properties and mechanisms. So this is giving an explanation for the projectability of human science classifications. On this kind of view, projectable human science classifications like phenylketonuria or schizophrenia, they're constituted in part by an intrinsic biological essence. And I should say that this argument, it's only meant to apply for human sciences that aim to formulate predictive classifications. So I'm thinking about classifications in cognitive psychology, medicine, and psychiatry. I take medicine and psychiatry to be kind of paradigms of these types of classifications that I'm talking about. Some specific arguments I'm going to make against Boyd, I'm going to argue that some of the mechanisms underwriting HPC kinds, they must be intrinsic mechanisms shared by members of a kind. In this kind of sense, I think that projectable human kinds, they're constituted by a partly intrinsic essence, as Michael Devitt has argued in the context of these species arguments. This argument against Boyd, it's really an argument about the proper interpretation of HPC kinds. Boyd, he's largely motivated to explain the projectability of HPC kinds. He takes a posteriori approach, and he's officially neutral about whether any of the mechanisms underwriting HPC kinds need to be intrinsic. I actually think he just says a lot of things about these things, and he's not really clear about it. I'm going to argue his accommodation thesis is not sufficient to kind of establish the projectability of HPC kinds, and I think to yield stable and amplitude projectable inferences, HPC kinds, they have to be underwritten by at least some intrinsic mechanisms. And I don't think this is particularly controversial. So when I look at people who are talking about human science classifications as HPC kinds, they're almost always talking about intrinsic properties. They think those are the important ones, and I'm just trying to clarify that. Against Ian Hacking, I argue that human classifications that refer to HPC kinds, they're stable in spite of looping effects or classificatory feedback. Hacking, he argues that human science classifications, they're fundamentally different from natural science classifications insofar as humankinds are subject to looping effects. Because humans are aware of how they're being classified. People who are classified are going to change in response to how they're classified. And Hacking thinks that human classifications are always going to be being revised to accommodate these changes. And Hacking, he thinks that these looping effects, they render objects of classification in the human sciences inherently unstable. And for that reason, you can't draw any kind of reliable projectable inferences from human science terms. Against Hacking, I may argue that human science classifications that refer to HPC kinds constituted by biological mechanisms remain stable in spite of the kind of feedback generated by human science classifications. Against Ron Mallon, I'm going to argue that humankind's constituted exclusively by kind of relational or social properties. They can't yield robust projectable inferences. In his book on social construction, Mallon, he argues that entrenched social roles, and his paradigms are gender and race, which he presents as HPC kinds underwritten by relational mechanisms yield projectable inferences. I'll agree with Mallon that social kinds might yield transitory projectable inferences, but they're not going to yield the kind of stable and robust projectable inferences that are demanded in predictive sciences like medicine or psychiatry. And this argument against Mallon is really an extension of what I argue against Boyd. I think Mallon's, he's trying to give a Boydian kind of analysis, and I think it's at least consistent with some things that Boyd says. So let me start off with Boyd's account of HPC kinds. The HPC theory, it falls within this kind of philosophical tradition initiated by Nelson Goodman and expounded by Quine, where a satisfactory account of natural kinds, it ought to explain how natural kind terms or natural kind predicates can yield reliable and ampliative projectable inductive inferences. Essentialists, of course, they hold that natural kind terms, they yield ampliative projectable inferences because they individuate a set of necessary and sufficient essential kind of intrinsic properties which participate in laws of nature, right? This is what explains projectability. While essentialist accounts, they provide a pretty straightforward explanation of the projectability of kind terms. They're not well suited for describing the messier kinds of classes that are investigated in the special sciences. Insofar as these classes, like species or disease, they're neither mutable nor participate in exceptionalist laws of nature. And the HPC account, I take it, is intended to address this kind of problem. And others have argued that the HPC theory is this more general, it's supposed to be a general theory of natural kinds. I'm taking a more specific view. And I would point out Boyd's always kind of contrasting HPC kinds with eternal kinds. And I think he's thinking about essentialist kinds when he talks about that. So here's the key feature of HPC kinds. So first, there's the family of properties that are contingently clustered in nature, right? This makes the HPC theory a kind of empirical theory. It's driven by what you find in science. Their co-occurrence is the result of what may be described as homeostasis. So he thinks that either the presence of some properties tend to favor the presence of others, or there are underlying mechanisms that tend to maintain the properties in F. And there's a kind term that applies to things in which most of the homeostatic clustering of properties occurs. So in the HPC theory, HPC kind terms, they yield projectable inferences because their members share a family of properties that cluster in a regular and non-accidental law-like manner. So what explains projectable inferences is the capacity of a kind term to adequately represent, or to use Boyd's term, accommodate relevant causal structures in the world, right? And so here he's thinking about these kinds of properties, dispositional properties and mechanisms mentioned in Tsou that cause properties to cluster in a regular and non-accidental way. And so successful projectable inferences are explained by accommodation or fit between our kind of inferential practices and relevant causal structures. So this is Boyd's accommodation thesis. He says that successful projectable inferences and explanatory generalizations that are generated within a conceptual scheme, they offer something like abductive evidence that the positive kinds of the conceptual scheme are representing or accommodating genuine causal regularities. So as Boyd puts it, kinds useful for induction or explanation must always cut the world at its joints in this sense. And you can see, Boyd has this kind of a posteriori Kantian kind of approach to kinds. He starts with kind terms that produce reliable projectable inferences, and he aims to give an explanation for why they're projectable. And this is the kind of account he's giving. He's going to argue that these HPC kind terms are projectable because they capture classes that behave in a causally regular manner. So in the literature on HPC kinds, there's disagreement on whether any of the mechanisms underwriting HPC kinds need to be intrinsic. So this is largely among philosophers of biology who discuss species as HPC kinds. And they emphasize the importance of relational mechanisms like interbreeding with conspecifics or phylogenetic relations, descent from a common ancestor, exposure to similar environmental pressures. And they argue that these relational mechanisms are really important for maintaining the stability of properties, clusters associated with species. So some people, these are people like Malik and Griffiths and Okasha, they argue that relational properties are going to be sufficient to explain why the cluster of properties associated with species co-occur. Other people, Rob Wilson and Boyd himself, they insist that some kind of intrinsic properties are necessary to explain species. So Boyd's view is that for species, we need to appeal to some intrinsic mechanisms and some intrinsic properties of HPC kinds. In response to Ruth Milliken's argument that species are these historical kinds constituted entirely by relational mechanisms. So she talks about a copying process. Boyd objects that species, they're HPC kinds underwritten by both intrinsic and relational properties. And the importance of intrinsic properties for Boyd is that these shared properties explain the projectability of HPC kinds. And I think this is the right kind of move he's making. Elsewhere, though, Boyd, he suggested that HPC kinds can be defined almost exclusively in terms of relational and conventionally stipulated properties. So in other places, he's presented social rules, feudal economy, moral goodness as examples of HPC kinds. You can see these would be kinds made up by very strong kind of social properties and relational mechanisms. But I think if the considerations that he raises in response to Millikan, projectable kinds need to individuate intrinsic properties, is going to be relevant for species, it should apply to HPC kinds more generally. So, my position is that the naturalness of natural kinds, it should be identified as in traditional essentialist accounts with intrinsic and natural properties, which explain the projectability of HPC kind terms. And so this kind of motivates my kind of argument. To yield robust projectable inferences, HPC kinds need to individuate some intrinsic properties. And I think, I think Boyd's actually, he endorses something like this, but he's a big lumper. If you've read his work, he tends to lump everything together. And he's very enthusiastic about calling anything an HPC kind, right? You know, the HPC theory, this is an argument for scientific realism. So he uses this theory in all sorts of ways, and he talks about feudal economies and things like that. And, you know, when he says that like feudal economies are HPC kinds, I'm just like, you can't draw any projectable inferences from that. And in his own analysis, he's thinking about economic historians, how they adopt these terms. And they might adopt them for explanatory reasons, but they don't care about predictions when they formulate these kind terms. So I think he's a bit sloppy, and he's a bit kind of undisciplined in what he applies his theory to. So I think when thinking about species, it's important to distinguish between two different kinds of roles that causal mechanisms play in the theory of HPC kinds. I think these two different roles are often conflated in the literature, especially the species literature. So from a metaphysical standpoint, mechanisms, they fix the stability of natural classes and explain the unity or homeostasis of the properties are used to identify kinds. But from an epistemological standpoint, mechanisms ground the stability of projectable inferences made about kinds. So I think it's clear that relational mechanisms are going to be important for addressing this first question about, you know, why there's a homeostasis among a bunch of properties, but they're not going to be sufficient to address the second issue, right? And this, you know, this is where I draw on something, insights of Devitt's kind of analysis. Relational mechanisms are too general to kind of yield specific inferences about members of particular species, right? So if you're appealing to things like, you know, interbreeding with conspecifics or descent from a common ancestor, this can help, you know, address this kind of metaphysical problem, but it's not going to give us any guidance about this kind of projectability problem. And so for projectable inferences about a particular species to be made, I think a kind term needs to individuate some intrinsic properties shared by its members, like genetic properties that explain the physiological and morphological features of species. So this distinction I'm drawing, it's related, it's not entirely mapping on to a distinction Devitt draws between structural explanations and historical explanations. So this is a distinction Devitt takes from Ernest Mayr and Philip Kitcher. For him, structural or proximate explanations, they explain the phenotypic traits of organisms by means of underlying structures and mechanisms. Whereas structural explanations, they typically need to appeal to intrinsic properties. The historical explanations, by contrast, they explain evolutionary history that led to a mechanism being present in members. So while historical explanations are going to appeal to relational properties, they're going to map onto this kind of metaphysical role I've given mechanisms, the structural explanations are going to be closely related to this kind of the kind of mechanisms we need to address this epistemological problem. But it doesn't really map on, because I think Devitt's talking about this in context of species arguments, where one kind of problem that concepts of species have to address are the trait problem. Why do organisms have specific traits? This projectability problem is a bit different, and I think it's more central to kind of Boyd's interests. So for my purposes, I'm going to say if the theory of HPC kinds is going to explain projectable inferences, robust and ampliative ones, intrinsic properties or mechanisms are going to be doing that explanatory work. So this is the kind of minimal intrinsic essentialism that I'm defending in the paper. So let me move on and talk about human kinds a bit. So my main argument is going to be that projectable human science classifications individuate HPC kinds constituted by intrinsic biological properties and mechanisms. Put more simply, you could just say projectable human science classifications are going to individuate biological kinds. So an issue that's being raised in the kind of hacking Boyd exchange at the 1989 Oberlin Colloquium of Philosophy is whether, so this is published in Phil Studies, it's whether human or social kinds can be natural kinds. So Boyd is predictably optimistic that the HPC theory can apply to human kinds. Hacking's quite pessimistic, right? And he argues that in contrast with natural kind classifications, humankind classifications like multiple personality or homosexuality, they're made up, right? This is his making up people project. And he says, quote, the histories of humankinds are different from those of natural kinds. For as some classifications, he's talking about human classifications, are formed and molded, they loop back, interact with, and alter the individuals and types of behaviors to which they apply, right? So this is a proto version of what hacking subsequently formulates as the looping effects of humankinds. And these are cases where the meaning of human science classifications change the experiences and behaviors of classified people such that the classifications must be revised, right? So as Hacking puts it, people classified in a certain way tend to conform to or grow into the ways that they're described, but they also evolve in their own ways so that the classifications and descriptions have to be constantly revised. So looping effects, they imply that natural or in different kinds cited in the natural sciences are fundamentally different from the human kinds or interactive kinds studied in the human sciences. The natural or indifferent kinds classified in the natural sciences like electrons or H2O, they're not going to change based on how they're classified. The human kinds or interactive kinds classified in the human and social sciences like attention deficit disorder or autism, they're aware of and they'll change in response to how they're classified. And on the basis of this kind of distinction, Hacking draws this radical conclusion that because of looping effects, human science classifications, they can't yield stable projectable inferences, right? He says that what they're classifying, trying to classify are moving targets, right? And so here's what Hacking says about it. He says, we think of kinds of people as definite classes defined by definite properties, but it's not quite like that. They're moving targets because our investigations interact with the targets themselves and change them. And since they're changed, they're not quite the same kind of people as before. The target is moved. That's the looping effect. So the argument goes something like this, right? If human science classifications change the people that they classify, the classifications need to be revised, and we see a constant kind of loop, right? And if humankind's classifications are perpetually unstable in this way, humankind's, they can't be natural kinds, and their classifications, they can't yield stable projectable inferences, right? The human classifications, they generate feedback that loops back on the classifications. Now, I've argued against Hacking's argument in other places, and specifically this conclusion that objects of classification in the human sciences are moving targets. I think basically this is a non sequitur. So here's a formulation of Hacking's argument. People are aware of and will change in response to how they're classified. 2, human classifications can change the experiences and behavior of the people that they classify. 3, human science classifications must be constantly revised to accommodate changes that the classifications cause among classified people. And therefore, objects of classification in the human sciences are inherently stable, right? So you can put this in modus ponens if you want. I've given you a simplified kind of version. So here's my comments on this argument. So I think 1 and 2 are obviously true, right? So I think people are aware of and will change in response to how they're classified. This is a trivial fact about humans as kind of objects of classification. I also think that this idea of classificatory feedback is right too. I think human classifications, they can produce changes in the people that they classify. But I don't think that 3 follows from 2. And so what I think is going on in this argument is that Hacking, he conflates the second argument with the third argument. I think, classificatory feedback, as I suggested, it's a ubiquitous feature of human science classifications. But it's not true that 2 implies 3. The mere presence of classificatory feedback is not going to entail looping effects. So I think something very specific needs to happen in order to get looping effects out of two. Basically, you need a significant number of people who fall under our classification to be changed in a very uniform manner. But they need to be changed such that the defining characteristics of the kind need to be revised, right? And hacking, he's ambiguous about this. What kind of changes are needed in order to have looping effects? But I think in the examples he gives, like multiple personality, you see the defining kind of characteristics or the criteria that constitute membership in a class are changed. And hacking, he has not shown that this inevitably is going to happen. And note that if a human science classification aims to classify a biological kind associated with some kind of intrinsic biological essence, objects of classification can be stable even if we have classificatory feedback, right? So I think the upshot here is that human classifications that refer to biological kinds are going to be stable targets of classification despite the presence of feedback. So this clearly applies to various medical classifications like HIV, chlamydia, breast cancer that can cause classificatory feedback, right? I'm thinking about medical classifications that can be stigmatizing for patients, while being diagnosed with it, as being HIV positive is going to invariably change the experiences and behavior of classified people. The ways in which classified people change, it's not going to necessarily require any changes to the meaning of HIV or the symptoms used to diagnose it, right? And the HIV classification is going to be stable because it refers to a biological kind, right? It's a immunodeficiency virus. So I think it also applies to various psychiatric classifications that try to individuate biological kinds, so schizophrenia, bipolar, or depression. While being diagnosed with depression will invariably change the experiences and behavior of classified individuals, the presence of this kind of feedback is not going to require revisions to the meaning of major depression or the criteria used to define it, right? Profound feelings of sadness. So biological kinds are going to be stable targets of classification despite the presence of classificatory feedback. And while I think there are some examples of looping effects in the human sciences, so I think about hysteria, I think about multiple personality, I think these cases are far less prevalent than hacking suggests. And they are going to involve classifications that are tracking social properties rather than biological ones. Right? So I think human classifications that refer to biological kinds are going to be stable, despite the presence of classificatory feedback. And when a kind of human classification tracks a biological kind, we're going to have a stable object of classification. I'll just mention, some other people like Muhammad Ali Khalidi, Sally Haslanger, Rachel Cooper, Jim Bogan, they suggest, there's something analogous for some natural science classifications. So they think looping effects might not be specific to human science classifications. I won't talk about this too much, but I think Khalidi, he gives a really good argument in his BJPS article on this. Let me go on and talk about Malin. So my argument that projectable human science classifications individuate biological kinds, it implies that classifications of social kinds can't yield robust projectable inferences. And Ron Malin, he makes precisely this type of argument. So drawing on Boyd's enthusiasm for extending HPC kinds to social kinds, Malin argues that socially constructed categories like race and gender, they yield projectable inferences when they refer to HPC kinds constituted by social properties. So Malin, he defends this realist account of social construction, which explains the social reality of humankind in terms of social roles. And according to Malin, social roles are structured by a variety of representations. This includes a whole lot of things. So attitudes, theories, narratives, concepts, models, pictures, texts. And in this framework, a social role exists if representations pick out a category of persons and a set of beliefs and evaluations associated with the terms. And most of the beliefs and evaluations associated with the role are common knowledge, right? And for the second condition, Malin, he thinks it's achieved through the public broadcasting of information by, for example, scientific institutions or media reports or other credible sources concerning the social role, right? So it's similar to Hacking's idea of looping effects. And when social roles are entrenched by cultures, by various social and relational mechanisms like looping effects that stabilize the category, the formalization of a social role by scientific institutions, right? They think it's a scientific kind. They become transformed into projectable human kinds, right? Social categories that support inductive inferences, predictions, and explanation. And Malin's explanation of the projectability of socially constructed categories appeals to this idea that entrenched social roles are HPC kinds. And Malin, he finds the HPC theory attractive for its liberalization of the properties that define kinds to include relational properties in addition to intrinsic ones. He says it, quote, opens the door to properties that result from human practices, norms, conventions, and so forth. And these are precisely the kinds of mechanisms that Malin argues sustain and entrench social roles. So he says the following, he says, causally significant social roles could figure as the homeostatic mechanism at the center of important cluster kinds that structure our social world. Go down to the last sentence. Social roles that produce and sustain property cluster kinds may support induction, prediction, and explanation. So I think Malin's kind of account of how social roles produce an HPC kind is somewhat murky. I don't think he ever gives a really clear account of this. But the basic idea is that entrenched social roles, they acquire a kind of causal significance insofar as there's real and systematic causal consequences of being a member of a category, which ground the kind of projectable inferences we can draw from these classifications. So I've argued elsewhere that while the social kinds invoked in Malin's social role account, they might yield transitory projectable inferences. Classifications that individuate biological kinds yield stable and robust projectable inferences. So if you consider Malin's paradigms of social kinds, race and gender, Malin, he's interested in how these categories yield projectable inferences related to oppression. And in this light, these categories, they obviously do yield some ampliative inferences related to oppression, right? So for example, we can predict that, African-American men are more likely to be arrested by the police in the United States. We can predict that women are more likely to spend time on household chores than men, right? So these kind of projectable inferences, if in fact they're predictively valid, they're transitory, right? Because the social mechanisms that ground them, things like racism, sexism, they're subject to change. By contrast, classifications of biological kinds like PKU, phenylketonuria, they yield robust projectable inferences, right? So we know that if you put an infant with PKU on a phenylalanine-free diet during a critical period, this is going to allow the brain myelination to occur normally. And these kinds of projectable inferences, they persist over much longer timescales and across different social contexts. And these projectable inferences are robust because they're causal consequences of stable intrinsic biological properties, right? So PKU, it's constituted by a lack of a liver enzyme, phenylalanine hydroxylase, which interferes with brain myelination when excessive phenylalanine enters the bloodstream. So I think the projectable inferences yielded by classifications of biological kinds will be stable, as stable as the biological processes that characterize these kinds. In the case of diseases, this is going to assume that there's some species-specific normal functions that contribute to health, and interferences of these functions have systematic causal effects. So here I'm drawing on Christopher Boers or Mark Lang. They have kind of functional accounts of disease in this sense. So while these properties and mechanisms are going to be subject to change due to forces of evolutionary change, they're sufficiently stable to ground robust projectable inferences. So although Malin might be right to say that socially constructed classifications of humankinds can produce projectable inferences, they're going to be transitory at best, right? I think in some cases, you see social kinds like, if you think about the caste system in India, they're persistent for a long time, but this means the social mechanisms are staying quite stable. But I think we have reasons for thinking, based on what people who study cultural evolution say, for thinking that cultural evolution moves at a much faster pace than biological evolution. And I'll mention in fairness to Ron that I think we might be talking about at cross purposes. He's really interested in showing how socially constructed categories are causally significant in the sense of, if you're a member of a kind, it's going to have systematic causal consequences. For his purposes, it just might be sufficient to show that any amplitude of projectable inferences can be drawn from these categories, right? And I think he's quite successful in showing this. My aim is really focused on what accounts for robust and amplitude projectable inferences of human classifications. And my arguments could require that classifications individuate a biological kind. So let me go on and talk about levels of classification in psychiatry. In this last part of my talk, I discussed my argument in connection with issues of pluralism. While I've argued that projectable human science classifications individuate biological kinds, I don't think there's a privileged or unique way to classify biological kinds. Human science classifications, like all scientific classifications, involve elements of convention insofar as the individuate classes are relevant to various human values and interests. So here I'm drawing on Dupre's promiscuous realism. So a pluralistic approach to kinds and classification implies that there's going to be multiple legitimate levels to classify phenomena, as long as classifications pick out natural similarities that unify its members. So I'm going to suggest that scientifically useful classifications ought to individuate intrinsic biological properties and mechanisms. And this can shed some light on the current kind of crisis in psychiatric classification. So in contemporary debates about psychiatric classification, there's disagreement concerning the appropriate level to classify psychiatric constructs. So in the DSM, for example, psychiatric constructs are classified at the level of mental disorders, which are assumed to be causally distinctive disease syndromes identifiable at the individual and population level. In DSM, mental disorders are defined operationally by a polythetic set of necessary and sufficient diagnostic criteria. DSM classifications have been criticized on numerous grounds, including their lack of construct validity, the high comorbidity among diagnostic categories that are assumed to be causally distinct, their failure to adequately incorporate relevant empirical findings. Today, my focus is going to be on the criticism that DSM formulates its classifications at inappropriate level of analysis, right? The level of mental disorders. So disenchantment with the DSM's inability to kind of provide valid diagnostic categories stimulated the formulation of alternative classifications that define psychiatric constructs at different levels of analysis. So in the RDoC, psychiatric constructs like auditory perception, potential threat, reward prediction error, they're all classified at lower levels of analysis than the DSM, and the RDoC explicitly demands that there's biological correlates for these constructs. So hopefully most of you are familiar with the RDoC matrix, right? You define a bunch of constructs under various kind of domains like negative valence systems. And one of the goals is to kind of correlate it with one of these 5 biological correlates. And if you look at the RDoC archives on their website, you can see they found a lot of biological, I think it's an impressive array of biological correlates, which kind of indicates the kind of promise of this kind of system of classification. In contrast with the categorical approach adopted in the DSM, the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, the high top, it's a dimensional and quantitative approach that organizes psychiatric constructs in a hierarchical manner with constructs at higher and lower levels. So here's the representation of high tops. So you have at the highest levels, you have these spectrum constructs. So internalizing and externalizing, these are the big kind of meta spectrum constructs at the top of the hierarchy. Below that, they subsume these domain constructs like fear and distress. And you have the domain constructs, they subsume various kind of disorders. So you have a bunch of DSM kind of classifications in here. And at the bottom, you have symptoms and behaviors. So drawing on these kinds of methodological criticisms of the DSM by advocates of alternative systems, Katie Tabb, she's argued against the DSM's assumption of diagnostic discrimination, which maintains that the operational criteria of diagnosing clinical types will successfully pick out populations about which relevant biomedical facts can be discovered. And Tabb argues that the kind of heterogeneous groups of patients produced by the DSM, they fail to produce kind of appropriate research samples for discovering underlying mechanisms. So this is a pretty strong claim, I think. So her argument, it emphasizes the polythetic nature of DSM categories, which generate a very wide array of symptom profiles. And Tabb, she praises these alternative systems like the RDoc for providing alternative ways of formulating psychiatric constructs and compiling research populations that don't rely on DSM definitions. And moreover, Tabb, she chides kind of philosophers of psychiatry for implicitly accepting the DSM assumption that psychiatric constructs formulated at the level of mental disorders, what she calls diagnostic kinds, are the most important kinds of psychiatric constructs to investigate. And against this view, she defends a pluralistic view that encourages the investigation of a multiplicity of psychiatric kinds. So she says like risk factors, genetic biomarkers, personality dimensions, phenomenological states, social conditions, symptoms, etc., other than diagnostic kinds. Don't just focus on mental disorders. And in her ideal, philosophers of psychiatry will, investigate a very broad range of psychiatric kinds, which through integrative efforts will provide a more promising path for obtaining valid and pragmatically useful psychiatric categories. So I'll say I'm mostly sympathetic with Tabb's criticisms of how DSM's classifications have impeded the formulation of valid diagnostic categories in the context of research. But I think she overstates the impossibility of diagnostic discrimination, right? And I think a lot of this is just due to the fact that the DSM has pretty poor classifications. It has to do with the fact that they're not incorporating empirical research into their classifications. But consider something like the DSM definition of schizophrenia, right? So I think there's kind of content validity problems with this definition. So, cognitive impairments, which are commonly observed in schizophrenia, aren't included in the characteristic signs. A lot of people have criticized that aspect of schizophrenia. But this kind of DSM classification, it hasn't really changed since DSM-3. They've changed where disorganized thinking is gone, but this kind of definition has been sufficiently valid to facilitate the discovery of novel neurobiological mechanisms like the role of glutamate systems in schizophrenia, research on neuroplasticity, and in big GWAS studies, they've identified genetic biomarkers, right? So there's genetic variation on chromosomes 6 and 1 based on these DSM definitions. So I think this counters Tabb's pessimistic conclusion that diagnostic kinds formulated at the level of mental disorders, it can't successfully produce populations suitable for discovering biomedical facts. So my position on mental disorders is that, psychiatric classifications formulated at the level of diagnostic kinds or mental disorders, they're useful to the extent that they individuate distinctive biological kinds. And in that regard, there's a lot of evidence that the specific symptoms they're used to operationally define schizophrenia are caused by distinctive neurobiological mechanisms, right? So I've talked about this in other places, I won't go over it. Catatonia, that's being associated with excessive glutamate activity. And my position is that the robust kind of amplitude of projectable inferences that are yielded by the DSM classification. So we know that schizophrenia can be treated with dopamine antagonist drugs or glutamate agonist drugs. They're explained by the fact that the classification reliably tracks these intrinsic biological properties and mechanisms, whatever the kind of additional problems with this classification are. So while the pluralism defended by Tab is, I think, unobjectionable, her enthusiasm for pluralism, it ought to be qualified by the demand that psychiatric kinds are formulated at various levels should individuate distinctive biological kinds. So in this regard, I'm pretty sympathetic with the RDoC's bottom-up strategy of defining psychiatric constructs that correlate with biological markers, right? So you build up to mental disorders instead of assuming them from the outset. So for example, the RDoC construct of potential threat or anxiety, this is under negative valence systems. It's tracking what's traditionally being talked about as anxiety. It correlates at the level of neurobiological circuitry with the activity of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. This RDoC strategy of correlating a hypothesized psychiatric constructs with biomarkers, I think it provides a more direct, a more transparent approach for ensuring that psychiatric classifications possess validity. In this case, we're talking about criterion-related validity. The high top strategy of classifying psychiatric constructs at different hierarchical levels, where higher order constructs subsume lower order concepts, I think this suggests a really useful way for how some DSM categories like major depression, generalized anxiety, they could be classified at higher levels, right? So this kind of distinction between fear and distress, this is all due to like David Watson's work. He's one of the authors of the high top. He's really criticized the DSM definition of depression for excluding anxiety. Depression and anxiety might be the same thing, but there's certain kinds that move towards fear and distress. This kind of system that is they're pushing the high top, I think is very useful. My kind of analysis suggests that disorders, they ought to be classified at a level that captures a distinctive biological kind. So this implies that some fine-grained DSM categories like GAD or obsessive compulsive disorder or agoraphobia, they could be lumped together at a higher level of analysis, like fear disorders, if they're constituted by similar biological mechanisms. And I've also argued that for these fine-grained diagnostic categories, what really differentiates them are the types of social mechanisms emphasized by Hacking and Malik, right? So broadcasting of social roles, imitation of stereotypes, role adoption, which function to stabilize a specific expression of a biological kind. So this gives us more reasons for thinking it might be more scientifically useful to classify some of these specific disorders at higher levels. So just to conclude, I've argued that human science classifications yield robust and amplitude predictions that accurately individuate biological kinds. I've articulated this view by defending an account of HPC kinds that are constituted in part by intrinsic biological properties and mechanisms. Against hacking, I've argued that human classifications that refer to biological kinds are stable in spite of classificatory feedback. Against Malin's suggestion, I have argued that HPC kinds constituted exclusively by social properties and mechanisms. They can't yield robust projectable inferences. As discussed in my discussion of levels of classification in psychiatry, I think commitment to a minimal intrinsic essentialism, it doesn't imply a privileged or unique way of classifying human phenomena, but for human sciences interest in formulating predictive classifications, it implies that classifications should correspond to causally distinctive biological kinds. All right, and that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan, too. Yeah. And we can now go with the questions. So maybe if you want to write that you have a question or your name or something in the chat, so I can take the questions in order, that would be great. And okay, so Miriam Solomon, you have a question.
So I have a tiny point and a question. The tiny point is that our dog is not composed of psychiatric categories. They're not psychiatric. So whatever the pluralism is more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But the other question I have is about your confidence that that natural categories or biological categories are more projectable than social categories. And you give schizophrenia as your kind of paradigm example of a psychiatric category. And it is a good example. But the kinds of predictions we make about people with schizophrenia vary considerably depending on what social context they're in. So how would you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I talk about, so, I'm familiar with the cross-cultural research on this. So, I mean, the reason why I think schizophrenia is like a paradigm example is it's the kind of positive symptoms and negative symptoms of schizophrenia, they're kind of observed across the world. Whereas with depression and anxiety, you arguably see lots of variation in the way that depression and anxiety are expressed across the world. So I point to things, well, for example, the old argument was that in China, Kleinman, he's argued that, their depression's expressed by kind of in terms of somatic complaints. So you say, oh, I have a headache. Whereas in the West, it's more kind of expressed in terms of guilt, right? This is something very specific to Western cultures. And, subsequent research has kind of indicated that the somatic type of depression is actually the more universal type. But you see all sorts of anxiety, especially, you see lots of different ways that you can express it. So there's a kind of uniformity that you see in schizophrenia. And I take that invariance to be some kind of argument that it's ultimately kind of the biological kinds of intrinsic properties that are causing that invariance. So what it indicates to me that is that schizophrenia is obviously affected by social kind of mechanisms, but in terms of the kind itself, what it indicates to me is that the biological determinants are stronger than the social determinants for that. Whereas for disorders like anxiety, social determinants play a much stronger role in that. I don't know if I'm getting to what you're talking about. I mean,
I was just talking about projectability and
yeah, I mean, I'll mention, like antipsychotic drugs, they're efficacious, whatever limited effectiveness they have, they're efficacious for all these conditions around the world. That indicates that what's going on is.
But so are SSRIs.
Yeah, to a lesser extent, SSRIs too. And there's argument.
I would argue not, but yeah.
No, I mean, I've argued that in print. I've talked about how SSRIs are efficacious across different cultures. So I'm talking about the kind of the instability of the ways that symptoms can be kind of expressed. So you see a more tightness. This is all arguable, right? So someone like Kleinman, he's gonna say, well, in third world countries, like schizophrenia is much more commonly expressed as transient states, so trance-like states, and he attributes, so they're not kind of chronic like you see in the West, and he attributes that to kind of social factors. But so my confidence, I mean, ultimately I'm drawing on the paradigms of kind of biological kinds for me are things like PKU, trisomy disorders, things like this, where there's like no variance. And then you get to schizophrenia, you see some variance, and then some of the psychiatric classifications, you see quite a bit of variance. So it's kind of based on empirical considerations.
Some biological some biological kinds change over time, like the coronavirus, for example.
Yeah, viruses. Yeah, that's a good kind of. I don't know if I can do that. Yeah.
Maybe we can move on to the next question, and if there is time, we can always go back to follow up. So, Justin Garson.
Hey, John. I guess as you're talking, I always feel uncomfortable with the idea that diseases have their own mechanisms, or that disorders or illnesses have their own mechanisms. And it seems to me that often enough, not always, but often enough, when you know, biologists, medical researchers talk about mechanisms, they're talking about mechanisms for healthy states, you know, mechanisms for blood circulation, mechanisms for neural tube folding. And then they'll often describe the disease in terms of a breakdown of that mechanism. You know, so Alzheimer's disease is often described as a breakdown of the mechanism for memory, or spina bifida as a breakdown of the mechanism for neural tube folding. So you have this idea that mechanisms are kind of good and stable and adaptive, and then diseases represent all these different ways that the mechanisms can break. So I guess, let me just give you one example of just, I don't know if there's any, if this is realistic or not, but suppose like generalized anxiety disorder represents a breakdown in a mechanism for, you know, regulating anxiety. It seems to me there are all kinds of different ways that mechanism could break. It could break at a neural level, or a genetic level, or developmental level. But it's not as if like, there doesn't have to be any unity at that level in order to make good, you know, predictions. So I guess another way of saying it is that it doesn't seem to me, it seems to me that, say, the mechanism for anxiety regulation would be a good, solid, you know, HPC kind. But then the collection of ways that that mechanism can break is really, it's not like a kind in itself or a mechanism in itself. So I guess I'm just wondering if that goes against your view, or if you use the notion of a mechanism or an HPC kind of broadly enough to encompass all the different ways that a working mechanism could fail. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, good.
Okay.
I know you've written on this as well, and I've so basically it's the latter, right? So I said it very quickly. I said, so I assume that so I'm taking kind of Borsian notion of health, where, you know, there are kind of mechanisms that contribute to health. So these are the mechanisms. And I said, you know, that interferences will have systematic causal effects, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in trisomy disorders, if we know there's an extra 21st chromosome, it's going to lead to developmental changes that lead to the, you know, signs of Down syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these trisomy, you know, Edwards syndrome, things like that. So you know, what's important to me is that it's biological intrinsic properties that are doing the work, like developmental. So mechanisms might not be the right kind of language here. I mean, but I'm certainly talking about biological properties. Like on the issue of anxiety and depression, I've argued that we have good reasons for thinking they're not. I shouldn't say this, but this is kind of like Wakefield's argument. I think the DSM classification right now is picking out a lot of conditions that are probably normal, right? They fall within the normal range of biological variation. And so we're kind of classifying suboptimal kind of mood regulation as pathological. And so I've argued like depression and anxiety, those might be more usefully looked at dimensionally. Of course, there's going to be cases at the far end where we can say, yeah, there's something dysfunctional going on here. And even with schizophrenia, I mean, you know, the GWAS type research, it indicates there's like multiple kinds of schizophrenia, right? So like there's schizophrenia due to kind of variation on chromosome 1 or 6. There's some very rare kind of SMP kind of variations. And so, and it indicates, and you know, the genetic basis of schizophrenia is seen as continuous with disorders like autism and bipolar. So these might all be instantiated. If you think about high top, you could have a hardcore high top view where at the genetic level, at least, these are kind of very similar disorders, right? And people treat mania with antipsychotics sometimes. So. I don't know if that addresses your.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the main kind of idea is there's going to be systematic ways in which functional abnormalities are going to lead to what we recognize as symptoms of disorders. But this is going to be very messy and complex, and there might be very different ways that happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can I just ask a quick follow-up to that? So I just to make sure I understand. So if there were, say, like the GAD, suppose there were one mechanism for regulating anxiety, and it can break down. Maybe there's one kind of genetic mutation that could cause it to break, and then a second kind of mutation that could cause it to break. Maybe there's some kind of environmental damage that could cause it to break. You're okay with the idea this is still one disorder. It's not like there are three different disorders depending on which particular genetic mechanism happens to be.
Yeah, and so for like,
there's just one thing.
Yeah, for social
thing being that it has
like things that are caused by social effects, and maybe this addresses a bit of what Miriam was thinking about. The importance is in how the biological system reacts, right? So I think this is the case. You see it with depressive responses. So there's research showing that, dysfunction in the HPA axis. This is much people who have experienced traumatic events early in life, and this really makes their HPA axis hyperactive. Mm-hmm. And so it's clear that the social environment can kind of contribute to these kinds of things. But to me, the importance is really in the biological response and the fact that there is a kind of regular biological response that we can look at. I don't know if that addresses your question.
No, that's good. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So if some of you prefer to write their question, I can read it for you as well. Next question is from Awais Aftab.
Hi, John. Good afternoon. Is my mic working okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Very fascinating talk. And I also say I really enjoyed your recent Cambridge Elements book as well on philosophy of psychiatry. Very well written. So I've been following this debate in the literature for some time, and it intrigues me that this is always kind of framed in terms of biological kinds versus social kinds, which kind of like leaves me thinking like, well, what about psychological sort of like kinds and sort of like, psychological mechanism, and that aspect seems to be like, remarkably missing, because we can have psychological phenomena that cluster together, and they cluster together for reasons of psychological mechanisms and psychological processes in a manner that they cannot be reduced to a biological mechanism or biological kinds at all. And because of those sort of like the stability of that clustering and the stability of those psychological mechanisms, they can still yield sort of like robust predictions, and in a way that you could address them. And so I just think, just putting that on, so like, why is that deficiency? And I guess an example of that would be something like, for example, consider like narcissistic personality. It's a cluster of certain sort of like, psychological traits that goes together, and it has, it has sufficient stability that you can find narcissistic personality across all cultures. You're going to find narcissism practically everywhere, and it's sort of like, and there are, if you sort of like read about discuss psychological discussions of how like narcissism operates and psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theories, there are sort of like ways that there are certain psychological techniques that you can use to like approach that, and you can make other sorts of predictions as well. But you will never be able to, as far as I know, could be wrong, but you will never be able to reduce narcissism to some kind of a biological construct. It's like you're not gonna find like space. You're not gonna reduce narcissism to a set of genes. You're not gonna reduce narcissism to a set of brain circuits. It's a psychological phenomenon. It's the clustering that happens at psychological level that is sustained in many ways by psychological mechanisms. And so how do you approach that possibility?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Your question exposes like my biological reductionism, because I cite people like Dupre, but like he wouldn't accept my reductionism at all. So my stance is something like this. I think any kind of projectable psychological concept is ultimately going to be a biological kind. So, you might have thought, Skinnerian kind of operant conditioning, these were kind of psychological laws, but as it turns out, a lot of these are very biologically rooted, right? And dopamine systems in the reward center, things like that. I mean, these are one of the most law-like psychological concepts we have. In my book, I think I say narcissism is just the artificial kind. So I agree with you that it's kind of socially, I mean, there might be some biological properties it's tracking. I don't know what it would be, but my stance on those are that they're artificial kinds. I mean, you're a clinician. I mean, I'll ask you, like, other clinicians I talk to, they're always like, yeah, there's some diagnoses we would never give out. Like, no self-respecting person would give out a narcissism diagnosis. I don't know how prevalent like these kinds of diagnoses happen in clinical work, but my impression, a lot of the kind of personality disorders just aren't given diagnoses.
Well, they are. I mean, I think depends on the setting, and I mean, and they are particularly stigmatized group of sort of like diagnosis. So that also varies. But I mean, I think they're sort of like their presence and their sort of like stability. That's pretty well documented. I think especially in psychotherapy settings, especially if you talk to like psychodynamically oriented psychotherapists who work with patients long term. But I could generalize that, even to things like depression. You can have accounts of depression that locate the phenomena in psychological terms. So for example, like think about how Aaron Beck conceptualizes depression for cognitive behavioral therapy. Like, he conceptualizes depression in terms of cognitive distortions and automatic sort of like, thinking processes. And so he's thinking in terms of like, sort of like, psychological cognitive mechanisms, things like sort of like schemas, and he's addressing that sort of like, using sort of like, cognitive restructuring and sort of like, psychological techniques. So, and to the extent that cognitive behavior therapy is, efficacious, you can consider that predictably efficacious, So you can develop an account of depression that makes no reference to brain circuits, that makes no reference to brain sort of like to genes, to inflammation, whatever. And so, and so that's an inherently psychological account of psychological mechanisms yielding predictions in terms of psychological interventions. And so, in theory, can we accept that such a thing can happen, or do we have to insist that this must be reducible to biological mechanisms in some way? So basically, can a psychological account of depression exist even in theory, or must it necessarily be reducible to biology, or so it must either be a biological kind or be a social kind? What do you think?
Yeah, good. I mean, I think the distinction between biological kind, social kind, it's a distinction of degree. I like the kind of depression example with, CBT type examples. I mean, so my argument's really targeted on the research level. What should we be studying? We should be studying biological kind. So I think I am committed to the kind of view that when you're talking about things like depression, there should be some biological basis. And I think there's evidence that there is. Even, there's the very famous study where CBT, is as effective as antidepressants in improving depressive symptoms. And in fact, it was shown that CBT changed the kind of brain chemistry of the patients in similar ways of antidepressants. So, I mean, to me, it's interesting because you're thinking about how we conceptualize it. And, if we think about it as, a maladaptive kind of cognitive style, something like this, to me, yeah, I'm not sure what I say about that in treatment context. In research context, I just say it's important that what you're actually studying have these kind of biological regularities. And I assume, but I can't give you an account of, how that works in the case where you change people's cognitive strategies. So that's.
Yeah. Just like very brief follow-up. I mean, I do think there are sort of like biological associations. I mean, sort of like, like those going to be like, for any psychological category, we will find certain associations. But I think, that there's that question of like, to what degree that the category can be reduced to a category at the biological level. But another important thing is that what if we do sort of like an extensive research, like RDoc, HiDoc, and let's say in 3 decades, we sort of like, we can say with some degree of confidence that vast majority of psychiatric presentations cannot be explained as biological kinds. So let's say we only find a handful of biological kinds that say, let's say they explain 10 to 15% of psychiatric presentations, and the rest of the psychiatric presentations, the sort of low mood anxiety that people present with, there is no biological kind to it. So how, if in the event that happens, what should be psychiatry's reaction?
Yeah, no, good. I mean, for issues of classification, I've suggested we should have much fewer kind of disorders in there. But I think a lot of these fine-grained kind of presentations that you see in the clinic, these are different instantiations of depression, anxiety, right? In some sense, I think the old psychoanalytic categories of psychosis, neurosis, that was much more useful than what we have now, right? When I talk to my clinician friends, I ask them about the DSM, and they're just like, oh, no one thinks it's useful, right? They're like, I want to know, is it psychosis? Is it neurosis? Is it bipolar? These are the relevant categories for me to work with in the clinic. So if it turned out that all of them are psychological, I'd want to see evidence of that, because I think even like I've suggested, I think like depression, anxiety, they might not be pathological, but if they're harmful for people, I think you ought to kind of treat them anyways. I mean, if you can help them in any kind of way, I mean, I don't see why you wouldn't do that. So I think it could, medicine, psychiatry could work from I mean, medicine obviously does this. They treat lots of things that aren't diseases, right? They treat injuries, etc. Yeah, these kind of esoteric kind of discussions about, disorders, natural kinds, they might just not matter. You might just ultimately appeal to something like a harm criterion. And I think I'm somewhat sympathetic towards harm approaches to mental disorder. But for me, the biology matters, because I think that's what underwrites the regularity of them. So even in, depression with cognitive kind of interventions, I think what's allowing those interventions to be effective is the kind of biological regularity. And if it's, so you're pushing a kind of line Dupre would push. So he argues like, from a metaphysical perspective, some things they exist on their independent level, independent of other things. I'm more committed to an old school kind of reductionist kind of picture. And so and this relates to, I think, Miriam's questions about my confidence about the biological level. And you're pushing it too in a different way. Like, how can I be so sure a lot of these phenomena are reducible to biological kind of kinds? And yeah, no, I think it's a serious question.
Yeah.
I think
thanks, John. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I think we have a lot of evidence that a lot of psychological phenomena are very related to biological phenomena.
Thanks. So before the next question, comments from Miriam Solomon's Borsboom's network approach uses the kind of cognitive structures always after we were talking about. And now the next question is from Daniel Montero in the chat. So I'm going to read it. Do you think that multiple realization, that is the idea that mental states can be realized by one type of brain states in some situations and a different type of brain state in other situations, was a problem for your account?
Yeah, good. My basic position is no, right? So I can take this really hard line. This is a typical philosophical move that, well, if they're realized by different causes, then they're just different kinds. I mean, in some sense, that I think that's unsatisfactory. And one of the reasons I like the HPC kind is account of kinds is that it's going to be liberal enough to allow for different kinds of determinants to be relevant. So you can lump various kinds of disorders together even if they have different kind of causes. And for me, it's kind of an empirical matter. It depends on how different of the kind of causes we're talking about are. So in schizophrenia, I talked about these genetic differences. Some of those might not be, insofar as they lead to the same kind of pathways at the neurobiological level, some of those wouldn't kind of motivate having all these, fine-grained distinctions of schizophrenia. They might motivate having different kind of subclasses of schizophrenia. Like the DSM used to do that. I think DSM-4, they took out these, or DSM-4, I think they took out so they used to have paranoid schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia. To me, that made a lot of sense, right? Like catatonic symptoms are very different from like positive symptoms. And, there I might push for having, listing those as separate. But in the case of like depression, where there's different kind of causal pathways to get to depression, it might be actually more useful for depression. Right now the depression classification, the DSM classification at least, is very poor. In some ways it's too broad, in some ways it's too narrow. So I don't know if that answers your question. Like, I think it's going to be answered by empirical issues. It's going to depend on what disorder we're talking about, what kinds of different causes we're seeing.
Thank you. Yes, Danielle says yes, thanks. Is there another question? We are actually short in time today because Jonathan, Tsou, you're teaching just after this. But if we can still take like a last question if someone is hesitating. Otherwise, we can thank our speaker. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this very interesting talk.
Thank you very much for coming. And yeah, oh, and I see Borsbaum. Yeah, I intentionally left Borsbaum out, Miriam. I'll leave you to explain that. But yeah, no, I appreciate all the questions and your attention.
That's great. Thank you. And so our next meeting will be in 2 weeks. We will have Catherine Tabb and Lara Cook. So don't forget to register and spread the word so everyone is welcome and can register and come. Thank you very much again, and thank you everyone for being here today.
Hey, Zoe.